Right, President's Address. What have I been up to? It's been a curious year for me. Well, what about the last week? I think we've had a pretty good week. But why have we had a good week this week? Well, we've discovered new forms of life. I don't know if you caught up with that, but I can tell you that 3 new life forms have been discovered in different locations on the International Space Station, which is quite extraordinary. They were found some time ago. Before you imagine something from Ridley Scott, or Roland Emmerich in sort of sci-fi fashion, I can tell you that they are rod-shaped bacteria. They were identified 5 years ago, one on a dining table, one on an overhead panel at a research station, and the other in the Cupola Observatory Dome, which we've seen plenty of times. There is some thought that these have been identified using genetical analysis, of course, as they're rod-shaped bacteria. And on the website that I'm looking at the moment, it says that there may be some hope that these could be valuable in terms of future agricultural needs. New forms of bacteria. I know it's only bacteria, but it's nevertheless new life evolving like that is something that gives us hope, of course. Another thing that gave me hope this week was that I discovered something which I'd never previously known. I think when I was growing up, I thought that the oldest living animals that we might have on the planet, like many of you might have thought, were those giant tortoises, those that became isolated on Galapagos and Aldabra, etc. We know that they're capable of living to at least 100 years old, perhaps even 150 years. Subsequently, we learned that other species like the bowhead whale was capable of living to perhaps 300 years. Whales which were slaughtered still under Aboriginal rights in parts of Canada were found to have antiquated harpoons in them. And by being able to date the harpoons, we knew when those whales had initially been harpooned, thankfully survived and gone on to live a very long life, 200 to 300 years. Then we learned even more by looking at the eyes of the Greenland shark, which lives in similar Arctic waters. So it's very cold, water temperatures below 0 due to salt content, pressure, etc. And these animals we know can live in the region of 350, maybe even 400 years old. And we know this by looking at, I think, the parasites in their eyes. So we're still looking at very long-lived animals. But I've got to tell you that none of these species come close to the oldest living things on the planet. And in this very office this week, I was fortunate to have a sample of these ancient animals. Had been collected by the British Antarctic Survey. In fact, it caused me to have a very itchy eye because the spicules of these animals had broken away during their transportation between Cambridge and the New Forest, and some of them become dislodged. I got them on my finger, touched my eye, and it was a bit like being irritated by a stinging nettle. Now, the clue was in the word spicule, and any of you who are into your sponges will know that those are the skeletal fabric of a sponge. They are what holds it together. It's got sort of cytoplasm, a cell matrix which holds it together, but the spicules are the skeleton. And in glass sponges, they're made of silica, very, very fine, and therefore they can be irritating. How old do you think the glass sponge might live, though? Well, I can tell you that mathematical modelling suggests that one species of glass sponge may live for 23,000 years. 23,000 years, which is extraordinary. You know, we think we can go out and sit under a yew tree, many of us can in Hampshire, that's at least 2,000 years old. A tree that germinated before the birth of our language and our religion. And that is humbling. To sit under a tree like that gives you a sense of perspective. It tells you a lot about yourself and your importance. And I find that a necessary retreat to go and sit under an old tree like that, put myself firmly back in my box, as it were. But no, these ancient trees can't hold a torch to these glass sponges. Now, the mathematical modelling of 23,000 years is thought to be quite high, but the general consensus is that some of these species can last for 15,000 years. 15,000 years. Think about that. That's it's pretty much everything, really. Not pre-cave paintings at Lascaux, that was about 35,000 years ago, but certainly pre-Stonehenge, pre the pyramids, everything else that we might measure in terms of human not necessarily achievements, but presence on our planet. Fantastic stuff. The other thing that I had actually this week in my hands was this. I don't know, look at that. Now this is pretty special to me. I don't know if you'll be able to guess what that is. This is, look, small cubes that look like muddy cubes. Well, it's obviously not mud. You know me. This is excrement. Yes, these little cubes here are wombat poo. And then wombat has cubic poo. I love that. I mean, these are going to be, you know, right at the top of my poo collection now in terms of, you know, I'm really, really pleased to have got my hands on those and wash them, of course, later. Yeah, I was making a program this week about how wombats produce cubed poo. Not something you should try at home this evening, I hasten to add, but why they produce cubed poo. And this led me to sort of think I might give you a little quiz. And here's a quiz for you this afternoon. We had a quiz earlier with the young HOS members, and I showed them some of my rather extensive feather collection. And I have to say they got them all right. So you'll have to try and trump those young members now. I'll make it a little bit more difficult for you, though. Okay, so it's a who's poo. Whose poo do you think this is? Okay, and these are all birds which occur in Hampshire. No prizes, unfortunately. Where we gathered in a hall somewhere, I'm sure I could have come up with a prize, maybe a little sample of poo, who knows? But there we are. Whose poo's that? That's the first one. That's pretty good, that one. And what about this one? This one, oh, a very common species. Could have got this in my garden. There we are. What about that one? Very Jackson Pollock, that little beauty there. Superb. And then lastly, I'll give you the answers for this at the end. What about this one? This is a beauty. Look at this. What about that? Now that is pollock, isn't it? That's a load of pollock. There's no doubt about that. Superb. And again, this is another Hampshire species. So you've got to top the skills, the identification skills of those young ornithologists who are on this morning by identifying that poo. But away from the frippery of poo and onto more pertinent matters. Kingfisher magazine, firstly, before we delve into the contents, top work. I mean, the quality is absolutely fantastic. Photographic quality is excellent. I mean, it really does enhance that, makes it more readable, more accessible. Of course, it's packed full of information, but the photographs are simply fantastic. So hats off to all the people that have been working on that throughout the course of the year. Dropping down to the 3 instead of the 4 is, and look at that. What a fabulous picture on the back of the barn now. Even better one on this one, I think. Well, judging the photos, I suppose. What about that one of the peregrines? Truly superb. I love looking at those. I really do. I don't like reading this, though. This was from the spring 2021, and Keith is writing a book, actually, Where to Watch Birds in Dorset, Hampshire. He's updating another edition of Where to Watch Birds in Hampshire, Dorset, and the Isle of Wight, and it's going to be published later in the year. But there's a note here about Martin Down National Nature Reserve. Now, it's always been one of my favourite places in the world. It gives me a sense of history, Martin Down. It's a landscape that I imagine as being sort of, I don't know, you know, my Iron Age ancestors, the hill fort there, that open grassland. And on a wild, windy day, Martin Down is a very special place. It carries a real aura. And I've been going there since I was a teenager. So it was sad reading when I read this. The days when this was a key site for seeing stone curlew and nightingale are now a distant memory. I'm 60 years old this year, and in 1984, for my birthday on May the 4th, no cards required, no presents required, not a lot of celebration going on when you're 60, I took my family there, and it was a pretty cold and damp evening on May the 4th. And we were looking at stone curlews. And eventually they came out. The nightingales put in a little bit of song in that valley, just where you get to the car park, up the slope to the left. And then we walked a little bit further up, and you could gaze down into a farm field, and no less than 6 stone curlews turned up. And they gathered together and performed one of their bizarre displays. And do you know what? I can still see that display now, in that sort of murky fading light of 1984. And thankfully, lots of 1984 have faded into the murk, but not this moment. You know, seeing them standing there with their bizarre shaped bodies contorting with that cacophony of wails that they make was just so special. And I wanted to share it with my girlfriend at the time and my sister and my mum and dad. And those were the people there, and Max the dog on a lead, of course. But that's not a distant memory for me. That's something which is there in my lifetime. It was only 1984. What was going on in 1984? I suppose it was Wretched Duran Duran and all that, Wham and all of that sort of stuff. It's not actually a distant memory for me. It's part and parcel of a time when I was extant on this planet and should have been exacting a more profound influence over its care, because now they're gone. I went to a funeral recently. A mentor of mine very sadly died. And I recalled at the funeral going out onto the Lower Itchen water meadows one evening, and he'd located a yellow wagtail's nest, and quite tricky to find the nest of a yellow wagtail. We parked the Land Rover, we watched the birds, and then we crept out, knelt down, he parted the tussocks, and I looked in at the nest, and I never for a moment imagined that I wouldn't be able to do that when I was his age. And in fact, that evening, we went on to find 2 more yellow wagtail's nests in that same patch of water meadows. But just like the stone curlews and nightingales at Martin Down, those birds have long gone. Now, I know that I'm preaching to the converted here. I know that many of you will have anecdotes which are exactly the same as that. I know you weren't there on my birthday in 1984, otherwise I would have seen you, but basically you will have those places that you visited where you have sculpted treasured moments, where those moments have tattooed themselves into your mind and you carry them through your life as totems, as somewhere you retreat to when you want to imagine a better place and a better time. And it's tempting, therefore, to be pessimistic about our future. One of the young people's questions that we had earlier was, what do we see? When we look forward 10 years now, what they ask, what will Hampshire be like in 10 years' time in terms of its bird fauna? And will it be what will happen if we don't do anything about it? Well, there's your answer. We'll lose those species if we don't do anything about it. The thing is, there is no need for pessimism, because we have an enormous ability to put things right. We know what the problems are in the vast majority of instances, and also in the vast majority of instances, we know how to fix them. And certainly one of our speakers later this afternoon is going to be talking precisely about that, about fixing an ancient problem. It's been tried, it's been tested, and it works. So given that we've got this arsenal of abilities and technologies, that we've invested in understanding the ecology and the behavior, and then we've taken risks sometimes with trials, and they've paid off because we've practiced and honed those skills. Why is it that there are no stone curlews and no nightingale? Well, in the case of migratory birds, we can't take all of the blame. There are problems in other parts of their range, of course. But nevertheless, we know that we live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. But that's an astonishing thing. When you think about the passion, how many people are here? 168 people currently in our community, passionate ornithologists, people who are motivated to set their alarm clocks, to get out in wind, rain and shine, to go and look at birds, some of whom have been doing it for a lifetime, some are others who will be doing it for a lifetime. That passion also represents an enormous collective energy. The motivation. I mean, look at the Hampshire Bird Report. Look at the way that we monitor species in the UK. We have the best known populations of probably butterflies, birds, plants, getting there with bats, everything else, probably anywhere on Earth, certainly better than anywhere in Europe. Tiny parts of the rest of the world might be better monitored, but not on the scale. And that's down to you. It's down to your skills, your expertise, and your energy. It's an enormous testament to the great British naturalist, the great British ornithologist, And it's brilliant, brilliant. Look at this, and another edition of Kingfisher here. Look at this. Here we've got 2 young members. The future of HOS is in safe hands, it says. Here we've got Hugo Wilson and Harvey Webb, and they've got their photographs here. Now look, to take photographs like this, I can tell you, you've got to be a good ornithologist. These birds don't just suddenly appear in front of your camera. You've got to understand their nature, their ecology. Look at this, spotted flycatcher. What about that? Another one of those birds. Fantastic stuff. So why are we looking at these losses? Well, frankly, because we haven't been doing enough about it rapidly enough. I firmly believe now that we're making a last stand for wildlife. We, that's me, that's you, that's every single one of us that's going to need to stand up and do things. It's brilliant that HOS have got this scheme in conjunction with Hampshire County Council so that we can assess planning applications, filter them, try to protect those which most need protection. And these sorts of developments are ongoing and potentially very dangerous. Only last night, I read on the BBC News website that for the time being, at least, we have a stay of execution over a proposed runway extension at Southampton Airport. Now, of course, we have to support an economy. Of course, we need jobs, but we also need a future, and that's jobs for the future. And equally outside of the skills of we ecologists and biologists, we have embraced the skills of economists. And there are a raft of proposals which are literally, as they call, shovel ready. They're out there, they're on the shelf, which would allow us to rebuild our economy post-COVID in a green, sustainable way, to generate new jobs for plenty of people so that we could go to live on in a healthier, more sustainable world. But that proposal, those offers, that thought, that skill and expertise is not being heard by those who we've voted to represent us. So as a consequence of that, we have to remind them of their duty. They are our elected representatives. In a democratic way, we chose them to represent our views. And if they don't represent our views, then we must politely and democratically ask them to consider doing that yet again, which is what we've done with our opposition to the airport extension. I believe this is probably not a time to extend airports. We need to reappraise what air travel will look like post-COVID, certainly. And then I think we need to think about how we minimize our air travel, all of us. And rest assured, that's something that's going to be on my plate, because I can't deny that through the nature of my work, I have an enormous carbon footprint behind me. But we are a living, learning species. We learn from our mistakes and we change our minds. And it's that change, that flexibility that we need to take into our lives. And there's no difference between changing our minds about that. It's the philosophy of that concept of having that flexibility to update, rethink, reappraise, and change your mind. And that's what we're asking to do just here. We're asking it to happen 800 meters from where I'm pointing, because we're asking people to not walk their dogs there or to keep those dogs on a lead to protect those curlews, the subject of another one of our talks this afternoon. If you can't change your mind, you're never going to change the world. And the world needs changing. So embrace that flexibility. Communicate your excitement for doing that. It's invigorating. Do you know what? There's nothing better, than saying, do you know what? That idea I had is now outdated. It's been surpassed. That thought that I had, actually, as it turns out, was wrong. Giant tortoises are not the longest lived animals on the planet. And then it's not bowhead whales. Actually, I was wrong about that as well. And in fact, it's not even Greenland sharks. It turns out that it's glass sponges. That's what excited me so much about getting that spicule in the side of my eye, which made it sore for an hour. The fact that I'd learned something new. I'd had to change my mind about something that I thought was a fact. I love that. I love it when you learn new facts and you can change your mind. And the new facts are quite simple for us. We can have stone curlews, we can have turtle doves. They've got them at Knepp, and they've got a growing population. They've got the growing population of nightingales at Knepp through their landscape management practices. We could even have yellow wagtails back in Hampshire as a breeding species, because we know what they require and we know how to nurture them. But to do that, we've got to change things. We've got to change our minds. So please keep that at the forefront of your mind when you're out and about birding in Hampshire. Let's hope that we can get together as soon as we can safely, because I think these sorts of conversations are fine virtually, but so much more creative personally, where we can share ideas, because people like myself don't have all of the good ideas. We collectively need to manifest all of those good ideas. And what's so heartening about these publications is that we see those coming through. And again, not to preempt one of our speakers this afternoon, but look, if you want to see some proactive, positive conservation, look at that map. This shows the track of a white-tailed eagle released on the Isle of Wight going to basically southern Scotland and back again. Remarkable technology, remarkable skills, remarkable endeavour, and a remarkable project. Still not on my garden list. I'm a bit miffed about that, but nevertheless, it will come in time. Before I go, I better give you the answers to the quiz. Okay, here's the first lot. Special poo, that's why it's framed. This was deposited by nothing other than a red kite. What about that? Red kite poo. I know you're going to wonder why on earth a man has got red kite poo in a frame on his wall, but there we are. Okay, this one. I said I could get this in my back garden. Yeah. Look at the splatter pattern. Tawny owl. Tawny owl, that one. And then last one. Now, this one actually hasn't done itself any favours, because you might imagine some quite spectacular feces from this bird, but its little poop here is underselling its place in the world. Yeah. This, no less, is the poo of a peregrine falcon. And for me, that even tops the poo of the wombat. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Kate, can you top that? Have you got any poo on hand that you can trump me with?
I've had poo from peregrine falcon on me, and I've had poo from stone curlew in the back of my car, because I put a couple of stone curlew chicks in the back of my car whilst a combine harvester came through a field, just to keep them safe. And they just sat there beautifully, and then one had a great big dump in the back of my car. And it really, I'd like to ask you this: why is it that poo from stone curlew is so unbelievably pungent?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Bird poo is obviously bird wee and poo at the same time. I don't know if everyone thinks about that. They have a cloaca, of course, so they have a one exit, if you like. We have a urethra and an anus, two separate exits. Don't need to point out the obvious, really, do I? But so when you look at the bird poo, and I'll can show you once again here. So the black material, or the dark material, is essentially the poo, and the white material is essentially the urine. Now, we normally pass urine in the form of urea. But birds, because they want to retain as much moisture as possible, convert it to uric acid. And uric acid is quite caustic, which is why, and also it doesn't dissolve in water very well, which is why when birds poo on your car, you want to get it off as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it sort of cements itself to the paint surface, and it's very difficult to get rid of it because you're trying to dilute it with water, and it doesn't want to dissolve in water. So basically, you've got a combination there of highly concentrated urine, and also the fecal material. Now, stone curlew, obviously one would hope, Keith, that they were eating, youngsters were eating plenty of beetles and things like that. And many of the beetle species, if you picked up violet ground beetle, you know they have a very characteristic of devil's coachman, pungent smells, which they can use to dissuade predators from pecking at them. Doesn't put off the stone curlews, of course. And it could be that some of that has transferred into the poo, some of that smell, that bitter twang of beetle. Maybe it was that. But I mean, on the whole, people think that poo smells bad, But that's something that we're taught, necessarily taught, because obviously excrement can contain quite a lot of pathogens that we don't want to infect ourselves with. So we are taught that the smell of poo is a bad thing, to keep us away from it, which is a good thing. But obviously, as a naturalist, you need to overcome that training. And obviously, but different poos have different smells, and you can identify them using those senses of smell. So again, a top tip to our HOS members this afternoon is, if you see a bird pooing and you can be assured that you know which species it is, maybe you ought to have a safe sniff of it so you can identify other poo at some stage in the future. And you may think I'm completely bonkers, but I, and others too, can smell the difference between different species of bird poo.
You could have a sort of book, Chris, you know, not only what bird did that, but also kind of scratch and sniff, maybe. Is that something you've been thinking about?
Those were the days. Scratch and sniff takes me back to the 60s, Keith. We better not go back there, because we start talking about stone curlew populations in the 1960s, we'll all be in tears.
We will. Well, I actually am going to have to renew a peregrine nest box fairly soon, which has been in place for 10 years. So it's probably had about 50 peregrine lots of poo thrown at it on a daily basis for about 2 months whilst the chicks were growing up. So I'll actually get that for your collection. There was one bit of AOB that came in whilst you were talking, and it was Jonathan Spencer, who actually leads on the white-tailed eagle project. In fact, Jonathan can probably get you some white-tailed eagle poo. I'm sure he's doing that now. He says lead shot, with something like 4,000 to 6,000 tons of lead shot in the countryside each year across the UK. Is this something where HOS is going to take part in the DEFRA consultation? And the answer is we haven't actually thought about that, but we easily could. I mean, clearly, there are alternatives which are being made available, and the government says it wants to move in that direction, but there's quite a lot of resistance from people in the farming community. So I think we could make some objective comments on that. Do you agree with that, Chris?
I certainly do, yes. We at Wild Justice have been looking at the issue of lead and how to tackle it, coming at it more, perhaps more obliquely. But we were quite heartened this week that DEFRA put out a statement which said unequivocally that lead through shotgun use was regarded as a toxin in the environment, which damaged both bird and human health. And we know that WWT studies have shown that 100,000 waterfowl die every year as a result of ingesting lead shot, and the tonnage of shot that goes into the environment is high. The shooting organisations have tried to introduce some voluntary self-regulation, but unfortunately recently a study at Cambridge University took 180 pheasants and analysed what they'd been shot with, and 179 out of 180 had still been shot with lead. So unfortunately the shooting fraternity are not taking this up as quickly as they might. I would also ask you to cast your mind back to the issue of lead shot and lead weights with the anglers, which when I was a kid was an issue. The angling fraternity turned things on their head very quickly. They very rapidly got rid of lead shot and lead weights, and they behaved impeccably and responsibly and responded to conservation calls really quickly. And we're hoping now that given the government pressure, that the shooting fraternity will move more quickly away from using lead. And as you mentioned, there are alternatives, and in many parts of the world they've been in use for a long time, and they are, I'm not someone who shoots, but I'm told that they are equally as effective as the lead.
Okay, well, Chris, thank you very much indeed. Thought-provoking as always. Judith Feeney, she actually put the comment forward that Chris Packham for PM. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to have that because you'd have to stand down as HOS president, but I'm afraid we have to come first. Thank you so much, Chris. It's been really, really interesting. I know that if people were able to applaud, they would be, but by all means, put your comments in the chat box now. I've seen a few already congratulating Chris on the comments that he's made.